Well, hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt. I'm a wildlife photographer based in Northern California. And this week I had that amazing experience of photographing a great horned owl in the wild. It was up in the hills of Berkeley, California. After dark, the sun had set, the fog was rolling in, no one was out there, just me and the owl, and it was awesome. But I thought I'd use that experience and share a couple photos from the evening, talk a little bit about exposure settings and how I took the photos, and then also take the opportunity to share with you a little bit of my insights as to why we aspire in these fringe cases to have those massive telephotos, because they really can make or break whether or not you're able to take advantage of that unusual sighting in the wild. So let's jump into it. I prepared a little presentation again, and I'm just going to walk through it almost like a lecture format with some slides, but hopefully it's pretty entertaining. So let's get into it. All right, so the first thing I wanted to do is just walk through the gear I used to take these photos and also just some of the photos that I took on the day. So from a gear perspective, I'm actually using a new lens to me. I got this at a pretty good deal, and I'm really happy about this purchase. I essentially traded in the EF300 f2.8 for a 400 f4. Now this is the Canon 400 f4 diffractive optic DO IS image stabilized Mark II lens. It's a really nice lens. It weighs about 400 pounds. It weighs about 4.5 pounds. It's not a very big lens. It's just about the size actually of like the RF 100 to 500 when it's compressed, which is pretty amazing. It's a little bit wider, but it's about the same height. This has the teleconverter on it right now. And so I used this lens in the field. It's really one of the first tests I had for it in a low light situation with the Canon R5. So this was the first shot I took from the evening, and I really like this shot. I like the framing of it with the habitat in the background and the foreground, and I think it kind of shows off the depth of field that you can get with an f4 lens like this. It also is nice because the eye looks really great to me, and that's something that's so intense about these owls. Great horned owl in particular is it has this bright sort of yellow blood, like almost like a blood orange, like a reddish orange eye. Really cool. And I like the glint. I don't get this a lot in the shots I take because the lighting has to be perfectly angled, but I really like the way the light hits the eyeball and you see this almost marble bright, I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it almost looks like a glass eye, and it's really cool effect. So I like the shot. I had to shoot this at 1/13 of a second, and this was entirely handheld. This actually was braceted against the tree like I told you at the front, and this was shot at ISO 12,500. The owl then moved, and it was really cool how the owl was positioned on this tree. So it moved to a different tree. I was able to get into another great vantage point, and it was hooting at this point. So it was doing hoo, 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 and it was so cool because it was opening its mouth and hooting off into the distance and looking for prey. And I just like this. There's some action to this shot that I really liked, and I liked the framing. I dropped this to 1/8 of a second, and at this point I had switched from electronic first curtain shutter to electronic shutter because I was actually bothering the owl. I could see with the electronic shutter, or with the electronic first curtain shutter, even the whisper quiet kind of like click of the mechanical shutter of the R5 was enough to bother the owl. I could see it looking at me. So I switched to electronic shutter. That also gave me the opportunity to shoot a little bit faster frame rate. And that's how I get these shots at like 1/8 or 1/6 of a second. You're not going to get many shots, particularly hand holding or even bracing against something, at that slow a shutter speed that are sharp. So taking a lot of shots can be a great way because you might get one tack sharp image like this one out of 20. But if you get that shot, that's all you need. And that's what happened today on this day. Like I was shooting very fast shutter frames per second, I think it was 20 frames per second electronic shutter, but I was able to get one or two that were like really sharp, and that's all I needed to edit. So anyway, that was kind of the experience with this one, which was pretty cool. Then I got a couple shots of the owl looking at me, which was really neat. So this was shot at 1/6 of a second, 1000 ISO, and you know, this was pretty cool because the owl was just like dead on, kind of looking straight at me. This is the shot you want to get. You know, if you're going to get a shot of an owl, you want both their eyes, beautiful colored eyes, looking straight at you. So I was happy with the pose. I was happy to be able to frame this. And then the final shot I wanted to share was this one. So this is another shot where it was looking kind of off into the distance, but the light had dropped way down at this point. We were well after dark, and you can see I had to boost the ISO all the way up to 12,800, which is my maximum that I'm willing to shoot in order to get this shot. Now it's still a nice shot. It denoised very well when I used, I think for this particular exposure I'm showing you right now, I actually used Lightroom, Adobe Lightroom's denoise AI capabilities. But for some of the other shots, I used DxO Pure Raw Lab, Pure Raw 2, Pure Raw 3 actually. And actually, I'll do another video on that maybe at some point, maybe with some of these photos examples, because they're starting to get really, really competitive. And Adobe is doing a great job at denoising now. So anyway, you know, I show you these because I think it's interesting to look at both the photos, because I'm proud of them and it was a really cool experience, but also to think a little bit about like ISO going from 1,000 to 12,800 and how I'm shooting here at 12,800 even at f4. And that got me thinking, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of an example. So, you know, so you want a Canon lens, that's what I call this slide, and you want it to be a telephoto and you want to use it for wildlife, so it's a 400 millimeter lens. Well, Canon really offers 4 different opportunities at 400 millimeters. You can get the EF or RF 400 f2.8, get that 2.8 exposure aperture. You can get the lens I got, which is a 400 f4. You can get the EF 100 to 400, which is a 5.6 when you're shooting at 400 millimeters. By the way, you could also get the RF 100 to 500, which ends up being a f6.3 when you're at 400 millimeters. So slight difference there, but basically the same. Or you can get the RF 100 to 400, that really small non-pro lens, that's f8 when you're shooting at 400 millimeters. Now I show you this example because I think it's really interesting to look at this and visualize what this means in terms of light gathering. So that's what I'm doing here. So if you think about how much light hits the sensor, now the difference in your head between 4 and 5.6, it doesn't seem that big because proportionally it doesn't seem that large, right? You're only increasing from 4 to 5.6, up 1.6 of whatever unit it is. But in aperture and light gathering world, that is a sea change of difference. And the difference happens because it's an exponential decrease in light as you make the aperture smaller, or as that f-stop goes up. So as you go from 4 to 5.6, you have the amount of light that's coming in through the lens and hitting the sensor. As you go from 5.6 to 8, you again have. Or as you go from 4 to 2.8, f2.8, you double the amount of light that comes in. And that's what I've illustrated here with these dots. So if we think of like f2.8, which is, you know, the best you can do at 400 millimeters with Canon, I think with any manufacturer. So you're shooting 2.8, 400 millimeters. That is the most light you could possibly get from the lens into your camera sensor. So I give that kind of 100%. That's the maximum amount. As you go to the lens I used, you've already have that. So you've gone from 100% to 50% of the light that you could possibly get into the sensor. And as you go to like the 100 to 400 at f5.6, you have it again. So now you're at 25% of the maximum amount of light. And then finally, as you shoot at those, you know, the 100 to 400 f8 for the RF telephoto offering there, that's halved once more. So now it's at 12.5% of the maximum amount of light that could come in. And this is why, this is it, this slide is why lenses like this that weigh a lot, that cost a little bit more, this is how they earn their keep, because they can perform in this situation like no lens could. And let's just look for a second at, let's just look at what that means and why that's important. So here's the exposure that I took. I'm going to use the little like laser pointer here. So this is the shot, this is the equipment I used for that last shot that I showed you. So it was ISO 12,800 and 1/60th of a second wide open. If I had had $1 million and I could buy that 400 f2.8, I could have adjusted my shutter or my ISO speed and had a different exposure. So I could have halved my ISO from 12,800 to 6,400, right? So much less noise, much sharper exposure shot. I could have also doubled the exposure. I could have sped up my exposure to 1/120th of a second, which would have made a big difference if the owl was moving just a little bit more, and it would have increased my keeper rate when shooting because I would have had a less camera blur, and it would have been easier to hold the camera steady enough to get a sharp exposure when you speed up the shutter speed. Conversely, if I went the other direction, say I didn't have the 400 f4 and I had to shoot with the zoom lens, which is a very sharp lens at 400, but it's f5.6, which is half the amount of light that comes into the sensor as my lens. So I would have had to halve the shutter speed, maybe slowed it down to 1/30th of a second, or I would have had to double the ISO to 25,600. And if you couldn't afford that or you didn't have that lens and you were shooting at f8, well, that would have virtually been impossible in that type of setting because I would have had to boost the ISO all the way up at a minimum to 25,000 and possibly as high as something like 51,000 in order to keep it at 1/60th of a second if that was necessary. And so I just wanted to share with you this, visualization really of why it's so important to have these types of lenses. And when you're in the field, how sometimes in these extreme fringe situations, it's really not possible to get a shot like this or this if you don't have a lens that can bring in that much light. And that's why I'm grateful, even though it's expensive, to have a lens like this, because I love shooting these types of situations, because there's something really special to me about executing in the field on these amazing experiences that I get to experience in a way that your eye could not see. And the owl does not look like that to my eye because I can't sit there for a 60th of a second and I can't adjust the sensitivity of my eye so much to be able to see that much light. To me and my eye in the field, it looks much darker. And being able to bring out that beauty and the brightness and the light of what's available light there to really highlight the subject and see it in a way that you couldn't with your naked eye. Well, that is, to me, a big part of why photography is amazing. And I feel that way about astrophotography, and I feel that way about like owl photography at night. So anyway, I'll stop there. That's what I wanted to share with you today. A bit of a long-winded video, but hopefully it's interesting to you. I mean, this is the stuff that gets me really going and makes me excited to get back out there. So I hope you're doing well and take care, and don't forget to get outside. See you later.